Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about my philosophy of history. I think that's an important thing because we all are aware of history. We all like to study it, those of us who are interested. History is a very important roadmap to life itself. It's a very important way to understand not only yourself, your past, or your future, by watching the actions of others. Because you have to understand, being human beings, we seem to have a habit of doing the same thing over and over again. So I have made it a point for many, many years to try to get to the source of history, to try to get as close to the history as possible. From the age of 10, I was interviewing people to learn about their lives, to learn about history. I'll always remember the first person I interviewed. Her name was Miss Holmes. She lived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and she had been working in Washington, D.C. during the Taft administration. She had been born in 1879, and I was interviewing her uh, when she was 88 years of age. It was really fascinating for me, and from her I learned a number of things, and I made it a point for the rest of my life, to talk to as many people as possible, to learn as much as I can, um, because in a sense, if you look at the written word, if you look at histories, they all have their weaknesses and their biases, and as do oral histories. I have made it a point to talk to people, great and small, who have influenced the world, who have influenced life, who have influenced much. And you know something? Sometimes the simplest of people are the people that tell you the most. It has been my fortune to talk with presidents, senators, actors, newsmen, writers, astronauts, and the like. I got to meet two Titanic survivors, learn from them. I've talked to people who are historians, who were at historic events, who have touched historic things, who knew people, getting to know some of the people who were the children of people who had great influence, like talking to Theodore Edison, Thomas Edison's son, or talking to Enrico Caruso Jr., or talking to the daughter of George M. Cohan, and many others. I like to touch history firsthand, if I can. In my library, I have lots of bound magazines. And in these bound magazines, which go back to the 1840s, I can look at history when it's news, and therefore have a totally different perspective on it. It's really quite amazing. If you take a look at what's in the writings in a lot of news articles written in the 1840s, 1850s, and 60s, you'll find a very different picture. I have tried to find writings dealing with the beginnings of the Civil War, before the Civil War, going back as far as I can. And so often you find so much more to the story. And I always like that. As I say, I like to see the other side of the story, be it in the history of the United States, the history of technology, the history of sound recording, whatever it may be, because there's always more to be told. I try to surround myself with stuff, and so I can touch it, so I can understand it a little bit. And here, I'll give you two examples here from two very, very strong extremes. This is a vellum document from 1681. Let's see here. It's even signed on the back. And of course, it is very old. But it is a contract for someone to sign over themselves to become an indentured servant in 1681. They were selling themselves to either pay debts, to survive, maybe to travel, whatever it may be. It's written in Old English. It's fascinating to read. Here's something much more modern. Of course, this has a story behind it. It's something that I got when I was a little boy. I went to a restaurant in Yonkers, New York. It was called Patricia Murphy's, a very famous restaurant. And you used to get little trinkets like this at the restaurant. And I have treasured this for 50 years since I got it. I remember getting it. But what's really interesting about this, and fits very well in history that we forget, our little friend here, is that years ago, if you had toys, let's say in the 1950s or 1960s, the place it was usually made was the place where they made cheap toys. Where was that? Take a look at the back here. Tells you everything. In Japan, that's where all your cheap toys came from. That's where all the cheap labor was in the 1950s and 60s. The world has changed. It's gone to very, very different areas. It's worked its way through Asia, into China. It's working its way back into Europe, actually, for inexpensive areas to get things. So you learn a lot from touching things and looking at things. Now, I have made it a point in my life to try to write about some of this stuff and show some of it. And I have created blogs on the history. Now, I'm not a very technical person. I'm an old-fashioned person in many degrees. In fact, using this whole system on YouTube is something relatively new for me. But in order to show you my websites, which I call my blogs on history, first one's called History in the Raw. I go back to, in many cases, the original object, the original writing about it, or whatever brings us closer, or perhaps a personal insight that I might have in it. And the address is, and I'll show it to you right here. It is www.edisoneffect.blogspot.com. It's History in the Raw. Now, I have a blog also I write on sound recording history. And this is the address for that. It is www.phonograph78.blogspot.com. So you might find those interesting to visit, to take a look at. I like to do history in a slightly different way. As I said, if I can use the original object, great. If I have seen it or talked to people who have, I try to write that in. I'm not a great writer. I wish I was. If I was a great writer, my goodness, I'd have an awful lot of books out. But I get my opportunity to put in a little bit here and there in the internet. So there are 800 articles in History in the Raw, and there's about 42 articles in the Sound Recording Archive. So I wanted to share that with the world here because I've done all the work and I'd like you to enjoy it. And I'd love to hear back from people and see what you think and ideas you may have, because we all learn from each other. See, history doesn't stop. History is ongoing. And I'm going to learn more from people, and hopefully people are going to learn from me. It's a gift that keeps giving, that keeps growing, and goes on and on. So I hope you enjoy them, and thank you for listening.